Bank statement arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesday was the day my wife used to make pot roast, and the house still smelled like nothing when I walked in from the mailbox. 4 months after the funeral, and I still noticed every smell that wasn't there anymore. I almost didn't open it. It was addressed to my wife, to Helen, and I'd been setting her mail aside in a shoebox on the kitchen counter, telling myself I'd deal with it eventually. But something about this one stopped me. The return address wasn't from any bank I recognized. Not our credit union, not the joint checking account we'd had for 31 years. This was from a private wealth management firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. We lived in Dayton, Ohio. Helen had never mentioned Charlotte to me. Not once. I stood at the kitchen counter and opened the envelope with the same letter opener we'd had since our wedding. The statement inside showed an account balance of $247,000. The account was in Helen's name only. The monthly transaction history showed a recurring transfer of $800 going out every single month for the past 22 years. I had to sit down. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because I've thought about it a lot since. It wasn't a shock. It was something more specific than that. It was the particular vertigo of realizing that the floor you've been standing on your entire adult life might not be the floor you thought it was. Helen and I had been married for 31 years. I was 58 years old. I had believed with the full confidence of a man who had no reason to believe otherwise that I knew my wife. $800 every month for 22 years. That's over $200,000 she had moved, quietly and consistently, to somewhere I didn't know about. I called the firm the next morning. I explained that I was Helen's husband, that she had passed away in February, a stroke, sudden, while she was in the garden, and that I was handling her estate. The woman on the phone was professional and kind. She said she was sorry for my loss. She said that as the beneficiary listed on the account, I would need to come in person with a death certificate and identification to discuss the details. I asked if she could tell me anything over the phone. She paused. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I think it will be better if you came in." I drove to Charlotte that Friday. 7 hours. I stopped once for gas and a cup of coffee I didn't taste. I kept the radio off the whole way. I needed to think, and I needed the quiet, and mostly I needed to feel like I was doing something instead of just sitting in that house waiting for a life that made sense to come back to me. The firm was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. A man named Stephen met me in the lobby and walked me to a conference room with a view of the city skyline. He offered me water and coffee. I took the water. He reviewed my documents, made photocopies, and then he sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. "Your wife opened this account 23 years ago," he said. "She was very clear from the beginning about how she wanted it structured." "Clear about what?" I asked. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 2002. Helen's handwriting. I would know it anywhere. The letter was addressed to me. It started, "Lawrence, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to tell you while I was alive." I put the letter down. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I picked it up again. She wrote that before we met, when she was 24 years old, she had been in a relationship with a man I'll call by what he was, a coward. He was charming, and then he wasn't. He was attentive, and then he was dangerous. She left him after 2 years, and 2 months after she left, she found out she was pregnant. She never told him. She made a decision, alone, that she has described in the letter as the hardest and most certain thing she ever did. She carried the pregnancy to term. She gave the baby, a girl, to a couple through a private adoption agency in Charlotte. She chose Charlotte because it was far enough from Dayton that she felt like she could breathe. She paid for everything out of her own savings. She named the baby in the hospital, knowing the name would likely be changed. She wrote in the letter that she named her June because it was June when she felt the baby move for the first time. Then she moved home to Dayton, and 6 months later, she met me at a church potluck dinner, and she said I was the first person who had made her laugh since before everything happened. The $800 a month was going to a college savings account she had set up for the child. She'd found the adoptive family through the agency, not to interfere, she wrote, never to interfere, only to make sure the girl had something when she turned 18. The transfers continued after 18 because the girl had gone to college and then graduate school, and Helen couldn't stop. She just couldn't stop. She wrote, "I know this is a lot. I know you're going to feel like I lied to you. I did. I lied by never saying it. But I want you to know that every day I didn't tell you was a day I was afraid. Not of you, but of watching something good fall apart because of something that happened before you existed in my life. Lawrence, you were the good thing. You were always the good thing." I sat in that conference room for a long time after I finished reading. Stephen brought me more water without being asked. Outside the window, the Charlotte skyline went about its business. "Is there more?" I asked. Stephen opened another section of the folder. There was a name, an address, a photograph. Her name was Audrey. She was 28 years old. She lived in Raleigh, about 2 hours east of Charlotte. She was a physical therapist. In the photograph, she was smiling at the camera, and she had Helen's cheekbones, unmistakably, almost impossibly. And I had to put the photograph face down on the table for a minute, because I wasn't ready. "Did she know?" I asked. "Does she know about Helen? About any of this?" Stephen said that Helen had set up a communication channel through the agency, a letter drop essentially, and that Audrey had been notified several years ago that her birth mother existed and was aware of her. Audrey had written back once, a short letter, saying she was grateful and that she was happy, but that she wasn't ready for contact. Helen had honored that. She kept sending the money anyway. "Did Audrey know my wife died?" "The agency notified her, yes, as per your wife's instructions, in the event of her death." I drove home from Charlotte in the dark. I stopped at a diner outside of Greensboro and ordered a hamburger I didn't eat. I kept thinking about the church potluck. I kept thinking about Helen laughing at something I'd said. I can't even remember what. And the way she'd looked at me afterward like she was surprised by it. Like being happy had caught her off guard. I thought about 31 years of pot roast on Tuesdays. I thought about the reading glasses she was always losing and I was always finding. I thought about her in the garden, the morning she died, telling me she was going to get the tomatoes started early this year. I was angry for a while. I want to be honest about that too. There were nights that first month back from Charlotte where I lay in the dark and felt something tight and hot in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't grief exactly. I'd already been living with that. It was something more like loss. Inside of loss. Like finding out that the person you lost was also someone you hadn't fully known, and having to grieve both at the same time. I talked to my brother about it. He lives in Columbus and he drove down on a Saturday, and we sat on the back porch, and he listened without interrupting, which is something he's always been good at. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do about the girl?" I told him I didn't know yet. He said, "She lost her birth mother without ever getting to meet her. Whatever you're feeling, that kid is sitting with something too." I thought about that for a long time. I wrote Audrey a letter. I spent 4 evenings on it. I threw out 11 drafts. The one I finally sent was 3 paragraphs. The one I finally sent was 3 paragraphs. I told her who I was. I told her that I had found out about her, and that I was not angry at her, that none of this was anything she had done. I told her that I had a box of things that had been Helen's, and that if she ever wanted anything from it, or just wanted to ask me questions about what her mother was like, I was available. I told her I understood completely if she never wrote back, and that I meant it. She wrote back in 10 days. Her letter was longer than mine. She wrote that she had grown up knowing she was adopted, that her parents, the people who raised her, who she called Mum and Dad without hesitation or qualification, had always been honest with her about it. She wrote that she'd had a good childhood and a good life, and that she'd spent years telling herself she didn't need to know anything more. She wrote that when the agency contacted her to say her birth mother had passed away, she'd cried for 2 days and she wasn't entirely sure why, since she'd never met the woman. Then she said, "I think I cried because it meant the door I'd been pretending I didn't care about had closed before I got to decide whether I wanted to open it." We met for coffee in Greensboro, a midpoint between Raleigh and Dayton, on a Saturday in April. I got there early and sat by the window and watched the parking lot. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photograph, but in person, the resemblance to Helen was even more specific. The way she held her head when she was looking for someone in a room. Helen did that. She sat down across from me and said, "You look nervous." "I am nervous," I said. She said, "Me too." We talked for 3.5 hours. She told me about her life, her work, her apartment in Raleigh, her friends, her parents in Charlotte, who were well and happy and fully aware that she was having this meeting. She asked me questions about Helen. What was she like? What did she do for fun? Was she smart? Was she funny? Did she have a temper? I told her Helen was one of the smartest people I'd ever known, that she had a dry sense of humor that took people by surprise, that she had the stubbornness of a woman who had survived something and knew it. I told her about the garden and the pot roast and the reading glasses. I told her about the morning she died. Audrey listened to all of it. At some point I noticed she had tears on her face and she wasn't wiping them, just letting them sit there, and I thought that was a very particular kind of brave. Before we left, she asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked if I thought her birth father had ever been told. I told her the truth, which was that according to everything in Helen's letter, he had not been told. I told her what Helen had written about him, only what was relevant, only what was necessary. I told her Helen had been afraid of him. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She protected me from him before I even existed, and then she spent 22 years making sure I'd be okay." She paused. I don't know if I can be angry at someone who did that. I didn't say anything. I didn't think I was supposed to. In the parking lot, before we went to our separate cars, she hugged me. It wasn't an awkward hug. It was the kind of hug that means something, but lands. I stood there and let it. And I thought about Helen in her garden in the early morning, the way she'd say she was going to get the tomatoes started this year. I think she was always trying to get things started. I think she was always doing things quietly, in the background, making sure seeds got into the ground even when she wasn't sure she'd be there to see them come up. Audrey and I text sometimes now. Not constantly. Neither of us is trying to make this into something it isn't yet. She asked me once if I'd like to see a photo of her apartment. I said yes. She sent it, and there was a windowsill full of plants in the background, all of them clearly well cared for. I told her Helen would have approved of the plants. She sent back a single emoji, just a small yellow sun. I saved it. I don't entirely know why. I just know that some things you hold on to not because they're big, but because they're true. And right now this is one of the truest things in my life. A girl I never knew existed is alive and well in Raleigh, growing things on her windowsill, made partly of a woman I loved for 31 years. Helen left me a lot of things when she went. The house. The savings. The box of her mother's jewelry she'd always meant to sort through. The reading glasses on the nightstand that I still haven't moved. She also left me this. I'm still figuring out what to do with all of it, but I think I'm going to start with the tomatoes this year. I think that's what she would have wanted. I keep coming back to the tomatoes. It's a small thing, I know, but Helen said it that morning like it was just another item on a list. I'm going to get the tomatoes started early this year, and then she was gone by afternoon. And now I'm the one standing in the garden in April, turning over the soil, and I think about how much of her life was exactly like that. Quiet work. Long horizon thinking, doing things for people who might not find out about them until years later, if ever. I was angry for a while. I said that in the story, and I meant it. There were nights I lay awake and felt something I didn't have a clean name for, not just grief, but a kind of disorientation, like finding out a map you'd trusted for 30 years, had a whole region drawn in invisible ink. I had believed I knew my wife completely. Turns out I knew her well, and those are two different things. But here's what I've had months to sit with now. Helen didn't hide Audrey out of selfishness. She hid her out of the same instinct that makes a person throw themselves in front of something to protect what they love. She had looked at a dangerous man and a newborn girl and made a calculation. Not a perfect one, not one she was ever at peace with, but a brave one. She carried that weight for 31 years without once putting it down on me. Whether that was right or wrong, I've stopped trying to decide. What I know is that it took a particular kind of strength that most people never have to call on. That's the thing about character. It doesn't show up at the easy moments. It shows up at 2 in the morning when you're alone with a decision that has no good options, only less bad ones, and you still choose the one that costs you the most personally. Helen chose to protect her daughter at the cost of her own peace. She chose to protect me at the cost of complete honesty. You can argue with her choices, plenty of people would, but you can't argue with the fact that she made them deliberately and that she spent 22 years following through. Audrey carries that same thing. When I told her what her birth father had been, she didn't fall apart. She sat with it, asked the questions she needed to ask, and then said something that stopped me cold. She protected me before I even existed. That kind of clarity, being able to look at a painful truth and find the human being inside it instead of just the wound, that takes real intelligence. Not the kind that scores well on tests, the kind that knows which questions actually matter. And me. I'm still figuring out my part in all this, but I drove to Charlotte alone. I wrote 11 drafts of a letter to a stranger. I showed up to a coffee shop in Greensboro, not knowing what I was walking into. I think that counts for something. I think the willingness to keep moving when you'd rather just stay still, to follow the thread even when you're scared of what's at the end of it, is the only honest response to the life you've actually been given. Helen left me a lot. The house, the savings, a box of jewelry she never sorted. She also left me a daughter who texts me pictures of her windowsill plants and a reason to get the tomatoes in the ground. I think she knew what she was doing. I think she always did.